court reporter is John, and he will now swear in the witness.
You could raise your right hand for me, please. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a cold day here in St. Louis. Are you from St. Louis originally?
I am.
My name is Brent Wisner. I represent the plaintiffs in this action. Are you familiar generally with what this lawsuit is about?
It's my understanding that it's a lawsuit regarding Roundup and a individual who has cancer.
And specifically a type of cancer called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Yes.
I want to start off with a little bit of background of yourself. What is your educational background?
So would you like me to start at my bachelor's degree, or would you like to start with my most recent education?
Well, I think you should start off where you think it's relevant for your job today.
Okay. So I have a PhD from the University of Iowa. It was granted in 2005 in pharmacology. My professional experience since that time has been in regulatory toxicology. I've worked for Will Research in Ashland, Ohio, conducting regulatory toxicology studies from 2006 to 2008. And then from 2008 to 2010, I worked for Seventh Wave Labs, which is another contract research organization which does short-term toxicology work and pharmacokinetics. And then I joined Monsanto in 2010, and I'm part of Bayer now since the acquisition.
Okay. Those various contract laboratories that you worked for prior to joining Monsanto, did they do work for Monsanto?
Yes. The Will Research in Ashland, Ohio did work for Monsanto. I don't recall working on any Monsanto studies there.
In you Exhibit 2,
Thank you.
this is a document. It's Mongley number 052475516. And it appears to be on the front page an email from yourself to yourself. Do you see that?
Yes.
So we have attached here a curriculum vitae. It appears to be of yours. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And in 2015, are you familiar with Dr. Donna Farmer?
Yes.
Did she work underneath you at that point?
Yes. In 2015, I believe she was a part of David's team.
David is?
David Saltmyris.
Okay. And so Dr. Farmer then and Dr. Saltmyris both reported to you. Is that right?
Dr. Saltmyris or David reported directly to me, and Donna reported to David, but she was in my organization.
And that was starting in 2015, December 2015?
Yes.
Prior to that, did Dr. Farmer or Dr. Saltmyris report to you?
Yes. Both Donna and David reported directly to me from September of 14 to November of 15 as the Toxicology and Nutrition Center lead.
When you were in the New Technologies in Toxicology, did Dr. Farmer or Dr. Saltmyris report to you?
No.
Do you know Dr. William Heidens?
I do.
Did Dr. Heidens ever report to you?
No, Dr. Heidens never reported to me.
Did you ever report to Dr. Heidens?
No.
Okay.
Bill was a peer. We both shared the same manager, reporting in at various times to Susan Martino-Catt and Sonia Franklin. No, at no time did I report to Bill, or did Bill report to me.
When you took on the role as Product Safety Center lead, did that require you to be overseeing the product safety of glyphosate and Roundup?
The Product Safety Center, yes, includes all of our products, which are crop protection chemicals and biotech products, as well as some biopesticides, microbial and biochemical biopesticides as well.
So if we go through the description here, it kind of describes the center, right? The first couple of sentences.
Yes, and the teams which are comprised of it, yep.
And it goes on to say the role provides scientific oversight and direction and people leadership to both the toxicology and composition teams as they plan, conduct, and interpret studies comprising two key aspects of the regulatory submissions and global scientific outreach for biotechnology-derived products. Did I read that right?
Yes.
And so in your role as the lead, you were providing oversight and direction. Is that right?
Yes.
Goes on to say the role leverages productive collaborations with Monsanto stakeholders. I'll stop right there. What does that mean?
Anyone who would have an interest in our products.
Okay. And external bodies, national research institutes, international trade associations, and national regulatory agencies to navigate and shape a complex international regulatory environment and gain regulatory approvals and freedom to operate for the company's products. Did I read that right?
Yes.
And so the Product Safety Center lead, part of your job was to ensure freedom to operate for the company's products.
As a part of engaging stakeholders, is part of that is sharing that data and communicating with them. Yep.
It says to accomplish this, the Product Safety Center lead must identify strategic challenges to the development of new products and the defense of existing products. Did I read that right?
Yes.
What do you mean by the defense of existing products?
So occasionally there are results published in the public literature which we feel are not accurate, and we take steps to investigate whether or not they're accurate.
And just off the top of your head, has there ever been a result showing a health risk associated with Roundup or glyphosate that you believed was accurate?
Yeah. Would you clarify what you mean by any result?
Have you seen? Is there a single peer-reviewed journal article that you yourself have reviewed in your capacity as Product Safety Center lead that showed a health risk associated with Roundup or glyphosate that, in your opinion, was accurate?
I'm not the glyphosate expert. I'm more familiar with, I receive summaries from the team members who are glyphosate experts. And so I'm not intimately familiar with the literature, but the literature that I've seen, I don't believe that the results report hazards associated with it like some of the literature says are accurate. No, I don't believe that. I believe the regulatory data set, which is much more robust.
So to be clear then, sitting here today, you cannot identify a single peer-reviewed article reflecting a health risk associated with Roundup that you believe is accurate.
That's correct. The literature I'm familiar with, I don't believe is convincing.
So it would be fair to say then, as part of your job as the Product Safety Center lead, one of the outcomes of your conduct that we've gone through, which included navigating complex regulatory environments, securing freedom to operate, that the outcome of that was to have white papers and journal articles published.
That wasn't the sole purpose of it. The sole purpose was to generate data to share with regulatory stakeholders to allow them to decide on the safety of the product, but sometimes we would write white papers and journal articles to share information. Yeah.
And journal articles, I mean, that is not really for regulatory purposes, right? Because if you want to submit something to a regulator, you just give it to them. Journal articles, that's for the academic community, right?
Journal articles are for both the academic and the regulatory community. There are some journals which specialize in regulatory data.
So it would be fair to say then, in your capacity as the Product Safety Center lead, you were helping drive the policies of Monsanto in the maintenance of the safety of the products that they were selling.
No, I was leading a team that generated some of the data, which would occur, which would demonstrate the safety of the products.
Right, and so you'd be making decisions on a day-to-day basis that would ultimately decide what data is pursued, what studies were done. Is that fair to say?
In collaboration with other internal stakeholders, yes.
But at the end of the day, the buck stopped with you. Is that fair to say?
No, I don't believe that's accurate.
But you did play a substantial role in making those decisions, right?
Can you describe substantial role?
Well, you just said the buck didn't stop with you, and I appreciate that. But you did contribute to the decision-making processes about what studies would be done, what assessments would be made related to Monsanto's products. Is that fair?
We would develop technical justifications and strategies and share them with other internal stakeholders to come to a consensus.
Great. And one of the products that involved was Roundup.
As a product in the portfolio, yes.
And is it true that Monsanto has developed a group of third-party toxicologists who come to defend Monsanto's products in the public domain, specifically as it relates to glyphosate?
Monsanto contracts with independent experts for their time and to provide their independent opinions on our products.
Okay. So that's a yes. There's a network of third-party toxicologists that Monsanto pays for their time in defending glyphosate publicly.
We pay them for their time, and they provide their independent opinions.
And Monsanto wouldn't pay them for their opinions if it didn't support, this is under the goal, oversee the production of, and in some cases generate, quality documents on an as-needed basis to successfully rebut allegations and proactively defend the safety of our products, correct?
So, as I said, the independent consultants provide their independent professional opinions. They're very highly regarded scientists, and we respect their opinions.
That's right, and they support this goal written in black and white here in the document, which is to proactively defend the safety of our products, correct?
So if the scientists are providing their opinions and we're not pushing them one way or the other, they're providing their opinions for us. If it's supportive, that's okay. If it's not supportive, we probably need to do more research into what their concerns are.
Within Monsanto's tox network related to glyphosate, is there a single independent scientist that is being paid by Monsanto that has publicly stated that glyphosate or Roundup can cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
As I mentioned, I'm more involved in the oversight of the tox work, and I'm not the glyphosate expert.
So your answer is no, you don't know of any expert that's publicly stated that Roundup or glyphosate can cause cancer.
That's correct.
Doctor, there is a distinction between glyphosate and Roundup, right?
Glyphosate is the active ingredient in the Roundup herbicide, in the formulated product, yes.
And when you say glyphosate is the active ingredient, does that mean that the other ingredients in the formulated product have no toxicity?
Formulated products contain the active ingredient, which is specified as the chemical which does the job for which it's intended. And then there are what are referred to as inert ingredients. Inert ingredients don't have that same mechanism of action in particular.
But would it be fair to say, though, that although they're called inert ingredients, they're not actually inert chemicals, right?
Inert ingredients are part of the formulation, and they're there to serve a variety of purposes. You may dye it or put odorants in it so that it's not appealing to people to ingest. And you might do, yeah, there's a variety of purposes of inerts, yes.
And for example, one of the inert ingredients in the Roundup formulated product is something called a surfactant, right?
Yes.
And a surfactant is a chemical which is designed to increase the surface area or the spread of the formulated product on plants.
That's my understanding of it, yes.
And the surfactant actually helps glyphosate get into the plant so it can do its job of killing it, right?
I'm not a product chemist, so I don't know.
So you don't know one way or the other whether surfactants help glyphosate penetrate a plant?
I know that surfactants as a general class aid in the dispersal of the product across the leaf.
You are aware that Monsanto has conducted long-term animal carcinogenicity studies on glyphosate technical, correct?
Based on the fact that we have registrations, yes, I presume that there were carcinogenicity studies conducted. I know that other registrants have conducted them too.
Fair enough. And those studies, those long-term animal carcinogenicity studies, those are primarily on rodents, correct?
Yes, the rat and the mouse are the accepted models for carcinogenicity studies.
And those long-term carcinogenicity studies look at whether look at whether glyphosate, not Roundup, but glyphosate can induce tumors in laboratory animals.
Carcinogenicity studies are designed to determine whether or not there's carcinogenic potential for an active ingredient.
And to the best of your knowledge, Monsanto has never conducted a long-term animal carcinogenicity study on the formulated Roundup product, correct?
The active ingredient and the the inerts in formulated products are subject to EPA review. And data is required, including carcinogenicity for inerts as well.
Has the formulated product Roundup has there ever been a long-term animal carcinogenicity study for the formulated product?
Yeah, the components of the formulated product have extensive data sets for them, up to and including carcinogenicity studies.
So you're testifying under oath that there have been long-term animal carcinogenicity studies examining the formulated product?
No, what I'm saying is that all of the components in there have extensive data sets.
I understand. There have been long-term animal carcinogenicity studies on glyphosate, correct?
Correct.
And there have not been long-term carcinogenicity studies on the surfactant, correct?
I am not the surfactants are not our products, and so I don't know what all of their data sets are comprised of.
Okay, but Roundup, that's a Monsanto product, right?
It is.
Okay. And to the best of your knowledge, Monsanto has never conducted a long-term animal carcinogenicity study on Roundup, correct?
Monsanto did the active ingredient CARC study, and at much higher doses than would be found in a Roundup product. Likewise, the safety data set from the other components would be has been found to show no safety concerns, and so there was not a need to conduct a study with the Roundup formulation.
So I didn't ask you about the need. I will get to that question. I'm just trying to get a baseline here. Isn't it true, Doctor, that Monsanto has never conducted a long-term animal carcinogenicity study on the Roundup formulated product?
As I said, the components of Roundup have been extensively tested, but there is no formulated product carcinogenicity study.
Okay, so that's a no. They've never done a study on Roundup, just the parts within it.
Not to my knowledge.
And isn't it true that even today Monsanto has to be careful about how it discusses any particular Roundup product, because some Roundup products have other stuff in them beyond just glyphosate?
I don't know the contents of all the Roundup products.
Okay, well, you're the head of the Product Safety Center, right?
That is correct.
Roundup is a product?
It is.
Okay. And in your capacity as the head of the Product Safety Center, you understand that certain Roundup products contain active ingredients beyond just glyphosate, right?
That's correct.
And so when you talk about the safety of quote-unquote Roundup, you got to be careful, because you might be talking about other chemicals depending on which specific Roundup you're talking about.
Yeah, this email, I've never seen it before. I'm not sure to what they're referring here.
I wasn't asking about the email. I was asking you about your knowledge as the Product Safety Center lead.
Then I'm sorry, I misinterpreted you. Could you restate the question?
Sure.
The question is, and so when you talk about the safety of quote-unquote Roundup, you got to be careful, because you might be talking about other chemicals depending on which specific Roundup you're talking about.
There's a lot in that question.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
I was having him read it back, and I thought it was a good question. So, but if you can't answer it, it's fine. But I was having him read it back again.
And so when you talk about the safety of quote-unquote Roundup, you got to be careful, because you might be talking about other chemicals depending on which specific Roundup you're talking about.
Yeah, I can't answer that question as asked.
Let's move on with the email. Dr. Farmer writes, the terms glyphosate and Roundup cannot be used interchangeably, nor can you use Roundup for all glyphosate-based herbicides anymore. Did I read that correctly?
It says the terms glyphosate and Roundup cannot be used interchangeably, nor can you use Roundup for all glyphosate-based herbicides anymore. Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I don't know what's in all the Roundup formulations.
I'm sorry, that sentence, do you agree with it or not?
I don't know the composition of all the glyphosate formulations, so I can't comment.
Okay. Sir, isn't it true that the terms glyphosate and Roundup cannot be used interchangeably, nor can you use Roundup for all glyphosate herbicides?
Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, and so that's there are other things in Roundup that are not glyphosate, yes.
Great. For example, she goes on to say, for example, you cannot say Roundup is not a carcinogen. We have not done the necessary testing on the formulation to make that statement. The testing on the formulations are not anywhere near the level of the active ingredient. You can make that statement about glyphosate, and you can infer that there is no reason to believe that Roundup would cause cancer. Did I read that right?
Yes, you read what was there.
And after Dr. Farmer made this statement in 2003, Monsanto did not go about conducting a carcinogenicity study on the Roundup formulated product, did it?
To my knowledge, there is not a carcinogenicity study with Roundup because it's not necessary, because the regulatory data set is sufficient for coming to the conclusion it's not a carcinogen.
Do you agree with her that you cannot say that Roundup is not a carcinogen?
I don't know what she meant by that, so I can't comment on that.
How long does it take to do a long-term animal carcinogenicity study?
Carcinogenicity studies in mice typically take 18 months, and in rats 2 years.
Okay. And then it takes about, what, another year or so to do all the histopathology on those animals?
Yes, that's the dosing period for each of those studies, and then there's the reporting process. Yep.
Okay, so ballpark, to do a long-term rodent carcinogenicity study, it's approximately 3 years.
That's correct.
So if Monsanto had started a long-term animal carcinogenicity study in 2009, by the time you arrived at Monsanto, and even today, we would have data about whether or not the formulated product induces tumors, correct?
To my knowledge, Monsanto didn't start a study in 2009 on the formulation, and so there would be nothing to report.
You do have a grounds for saying that we don't have an urgent need to study the carcinogenicity of the formulated product, right? You have a grounds for saying that, right?
Because the existing data set, which consists of data from multiple registrants, indicates that there are no carcinogenicity concerns, yes.
And in fact, there has never been a carcinogenicity study done by Monsanto specifically to look at whether the formulated product causes cancer or promotes cancer, correct?
That's right. We believe the existing data set demonstrates the safety of the active ingredient, and that the other data available support the safety of a formulation. Additionally, the feasibility of conducting a chronic study with the formulation is unknown. Things like the surfactants in there could irritate the animal's stomachs and make it impossible to feed them for 2 years. So as I said, there's a wide definition of what people might call ghostwriting. So it's hard to say what would be unethical or not.
Okay, so it's your testimony to this jury that you can't say one way or the other whether ghostwriting is just across the board unethical.
So it's hard to say what would be unethical or not. Yeah, I think that the fact that multiple definitions of ghostwriting exist, and so therefore it's hard to say whether or not it's entirely inappropriate.
When is ghostwriting appropriate, sir?
I think the term, as I said, I think the term means many things. Someone might use it as shorthand for providing background information or references or other things to facilitate someone else writing a paper. I don't see anything wrong with that. Ghostwriting could also be someone writing a paper and someone else signing their name to it as them having written it. And I would say that is probably, that's not appropriate.
Okay, so that second one where someone else writes it and then someone signs their name, so to speak, that's the unethical type.
I would not be comfortable doing that.
Okay. And you wouldn't be comfortable for any of the people that you work with or work under you doing that, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Now, you've repeatedly stated that studies were not needed to study the formulated product of Roundup, correct?
I've stated that carcinogenicity studies aren't necessary with the formulated product, yes.
Are you familiar with IARC?
I am.
What is your understanding of what IARC is?
I know the acronym stands for the International Agency for Research on Cancer.
Okay. And when did you first learn about IARC?
2014.
Okay, and what was the circumstances of you learning about it?
We had heard that they were going to review glyphosate.
And do you recall when in 2014 you first heard about that?
I don't recall the exact date, no.
You understand that IARC's, one of the things that it does is it tries to identify the potential causes of human cancer.
IARC reviews publicly available data to reach conclusions on safety. I think that often leaves out a very important part of data on the safety of compounds, which is the regulatory data.
I understand that, but you understand that IARC its purpose is to try to identify the causes of human cancer.
IARC reviews publicly available information on substances to determine whether or not they believe it forms a carcinogen hazard.
Do you understand how a compound gets selected for IARC review?
I don't have a lot of knowledge of that, no.
Okay. Have you investigated that process to sort of learn how glyphosate was selected?
Myself, no. Members of my team, I believe, have looked into that, but I wasn't very much involved with that.
All right. And so to be clear, it's your understanding that you first became aware that IARC was going to investigate glyphosate in 2014, is that right?
Yes.
And I don't know if you answered this, but I forget, was that around September of 2014?
That seems reasonable.
I'm handing you a document. It's Exhibit 18 to your deposition. This is an series of email exchanges. Again, you're on these email exchanges, correct?
I am.
And And these documents, this email exchange was sent by you in the capacity of your work at Monsanto.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So we see at the bottom here, you have an email that's addressed to, among other people, yourself as well, from Daniel Jenkins. You see that?
I do.
And its subject is EPA glyphosate. Do you see that?
Yes.
And this is Mr. Jenkins. He was a guy who dealt frequently in interacting with the EPA.
Dan was a member of the government affairs team. Yes.
Okay. And then down at the bottom, it talks about IARC, right?
Yes.
And this is in January of 2015, so this is before the monograph has actually met, correct?
Yes.
And it says, IARC, they are sending delegates trying to get names that are knowledgeable read glyphosate from EDSP and oncogenicity standpoint. Do you see that?
Yes.
And EDSP, that refers to endocrine disruptors?
It's my understanding that EDSP in that sense stands for the Endocrine Disruptor Screening Program.
And oncogenicity, that refers to the ability of a substance to cause tumors?
Yes.
Okay. It says the findings by IARC would likely be impactful on their analysis. Do you see that?
I do.
Now, you actually respond to this email, sending it, or you forward it to Dr. Haydens, right?
Yes.
And the only thing that you comment on is this statement about IARC, right?
Yes, I said that's what we didn't want to hear because we were concerned about the data that the amount of data they would have to review, and they might come to the wrong conclusion.
Okay, well, what you wrote, I understand what you just said, but what you actually wrote to Dr. Haydens was, re-IARC, precisely what we didn't want to hear about impact, huh? That's what you wrote?
That's what I wrote.
Okay. And then Dr. Haydens responds to this, this concern that you raised to him. And he says, yes, I'm sitting here pondering this as we speak, ... The $1 billion question is, how could it impact? Actually cause them to reopen their cancer review and do their own in-depth EPID evaluation? I'll stop right there. EPID, that's epidemiology?
In this context, that's what I take it to be.
Okay. And so it looks like there's a concern raised by Dr. Haydens that if IARC classified glyphosate or Roundup as being a human carcinogen, that it might cause the EPA to actually do its own in-depth epidemiology evaluation.
I think what Bill was concerned about was that if IARC came to the wrong conclusion based on a limited data set, that it would cause a lot of concern and a lot of additional reviews.
Yeah. Specifically, he was worried that it would cause them to reopen their cancer review and do their own in-depth epidemiological review, correct?
What Bill has stated is that he was concerned that it would cause them to reopen their cancer review and do their own in-depth evaluation.
And he was concerned about the EPA doing that.
Well, it says he would, no, it doesn't say concerned. It says actually cause them to reopen their cancer review and do their own in-depth EPID evaluation.
Okay. He refers to this as a $1 billion question, doesn't he?
That's what's written.
And he says, this is getting huge after what we heard on our call this morning. ... You see that?
I do. I took the $1 billion question to be hyperbole. I think it probably could have said the $64,000 question too.
Could have said that, but he says a $1 billion question, doesn't he?
He does.
Okay. Did you have a conversation with him about what he meant by the $1 billion reference?
No.
So you're just speculating.
I guess it's written 1 billion. There, that's speculation.
Okay. He says after we heard on our call this morning, do you know what call he's referring to?
I don't recall that.
Okay. Were you on that call?
I don't recall if I was on a call nearly 4 years ago on a I don't even know, but whatever day the 15th was. I don't
Sure,
recall.
I understand. And then you respond to this email, right?
Yes.
You say, yep, I had several of the same thoughts, right?
Yes.
Now, I want to be clear. You've read into this in your answers that there was a concern that the IARC didn't have access to certain information, and that was what this is all about, right?
The concern all along is that we didn't have our information available in the public literature for IARC to review, and so they would be reviewing a smaller data set and possibly come to the wrong conclusion.
I'm going to hand you another document. It's a little bit later in time. It's Exhibit 19 to your deposition. Have you seen this document before?
Bill, well, I'm CC'd on there, so I assume I've seen it before.
And this is a series of email exchanges between Bill Heidens and numerous Monsanto employees, including yourself, correct?
Yes.
And this is in February 2015, correct?
Yes.
This is before IARC has rendered its classification of glyphosate?
Yes, they met in March of 2015, and the monograph was published later that year.
So at this point, Monsanto doesn't actually know what the results of the monograph are.
It hadn't been held.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these emails appear to have been conducted in the regular course of Monsanto's work, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And if we go starting from the back forward, it appears that there was a meeting, an IARC planning meeting that occurred, and they're exchanging notes and thoughts about that meeting.
Based on the content of the emails, it looks like these are steps taken to prepare for the IARC meeting.
Okay, great. And then on February 19th, 2015, Bill Heidens writes an email just addressed to Dr. Farmer, and you're copied on it, correct?
Yes.
As well as Dr. Saltmyris.
Yes.
He's someone who works for you?
Yes.
And at this time, Donna Farmer worked for you as well.
Yes.
Did Dr. Heidens report to you or no?
No, Dr. Heidens has never reported to me.
Okay. Well, it says, per our call with John the other day, the next two most important things we need to do are the meta-analysis publication and the Ag Health Study follow-up publication, assuming we can get our hands on the data in a reasonable time frame. I feel confident that we will have organizational support for doing these projects, so I think we need to start setting them up now. Do you see that?
I do.
And this is in the context of IARC planning, right?
Yes.
What are those two projects that are being contemplated there?
It looks to me like the two items under consideration are two publications. So a meta-analysis, I think that was a project Exponent was working on, and the Ag Health Study follow-up publication. I don't recall as much about that.
Okay. It's your understanding that the meta-analysis was in fact performed and conducted by Exponent, right?
Yes.
But there was never an AHS follow publication by Monsanto, correct?
Not that I know of.
All right. But then after that, it goes for the overall plausibility paper that we discussed. You see that?
Yes.
Do you know what he's referring to?
No, I don't recall.
Okay. You do recall that there was an expert panel convened after the IARC monograph?
Yes.
That was done through the Intertek Corporation?
Yes.
And do you know if this overall plausibility paper that Dr. Heidens is referring to that project?
It's impossible to say, given that this is February of 15 and that was done much later in the year. I know that one of the papers published by the expert panel looks at the overall plausibility.
Okay. Is this the genesis of that idea, possibly?
I don't know the relationship of this over. Bill's mentioned it here in the actual paper.
Okay. Now, you recall earlier in the day we talked about different types of ghostwriting, right?
Yes.
We talked about ghostwriting that, in your opinion, wasn't so bad, but then certain types of ghostwriting that you thought was inappropriate.
Yeah, I think there's a continuum of what some people might call ghostwriting. Some of it is simply, it's shorthand word for gathering information, providing it to someone so that they can write. And then on the far end, as we talked about, there would be, I'll write this paper, you sign your name, which is inappropriate. I think there's a huge continuum between those two variables, and those are just extreme examples of the continuum.
Okay. So Dr. Heidens says, for the overall plausibility paper we discussed with John, where he gave the butadiene example, did I say that right?
I would say butadiene.
Okay. So let me read that again. For the overall plausibility paper that we discussed with John, where he gave the butadiene example, I'm still having a little trouble wrapping my mind around that. If we went full bore, involving experts from all the major areas, epi, tox, genotox, MOA, exposure, not sure who we'd get, we could be pushing $250,000 or maybe even more. A less expensive, more palatable approach might be to involve experts only for the areas of contention, epidemiology and possibly MOA, depending on what comes out of the IARC meeting, and we ghostwrite the exposure, tox, and genotox sections. An option would be to add Graham and Kyer or Kirkland to have their names on the publication, but we would be keeping the cost down by us doing the writing, and they would just edit and sign their names, so to speak. See that?
I do.
So he's actually describing the latter type of ghostwriting, where Monsanto would write the material, and the authors would just edit and sign their names, so to speak.
You read what is written there, but I don't know what was in Bill's mind.
Sure, but that's what he wrote.
That's what's on the page.
And that's the unethical type of ghostwriting we established a second ago.
If that's indeed what happened, that would be inappropriate.
Okay. He goes on to say, recall that is how we handled Williams, Crows, and Monroe 2000. Do you see that?
I do.
So he's stating there that that's what they did with that particular publication, correct?
That's what's written.
Did you ever talk to Dr. Heidens about this email that you received?
I did not.
Did you ever call up and say, hey Bill, what are you talking about? We don't do that kind of stuff here.
I did not.
When you read that email back in 2015, did it concern you?
I don't recall what I felt specifically that day.
Okay. Okay, let me hand you another document. This is Exhibit 20 to Deposition. And so this was a document and series of emails that were done in the regular course of Monsanto's work, right?
Yes.
Okay. And at the bottom, you talk about people having to catch other meetings, and that's for a meeting to take place on Monday, May 11th, 2015.
Yes.
Okay, so what we have here is your original emails on May 8th, and then Bill Haydens writes, all see attached, which reflects the results of conversations Donna and I had with various stakeholders, e.g. law, CE, RPSA. See that?
I do.
Do you know what law refers to?
That's typical shorthand for the legal team.
Okay. Do you know if that related to glyphosate litigation?
I don't know that.
Okay. And then CE, what does that refer to?
Corporate engagement, typically.
What's that?
It's how we talk with other corporations who are stakeholders for the downstream products of ag.
Gotcha. And then RPSA?
Regulatory policy and scientific affairs.
Okay. All right. He writes, this will be the basis of our discussion today. Thanks. You see that?
I do.
So it appears that Dr. Haydens is sharing this document in anticipation of a meeting that you're going to be having later that day on May 11th.
Yes, that's my interpretation as well.
Okay. So if we look at the attachment, the title of the document is Proposal for Post-IARC Meeting Scientific Projects Draft, May 11th, 2015. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. And then if we turn to the next page, it starts off with why do more? The first bullet point says severe stigma attached to Group 2A classification. Do you see that?
I see it written there.
Did you agree that when IARC classified glyphosate as a Class 2A carcinogen, that it put a stigma on Roundup?
When they came to the 2A conclusion, I thought they got the wrong answer and a potentially bad answer. And so that's what I thought at the time.
Okay. If you go down here, this is in response, these bullet points, bless you, is a response to the question, why do more, right? And if you read the bullet point, it says, provide additional support, quote, air cover to future regulatory reviews. Do you see that?
I do.
What does that mean?
I don't know.
Okay. What does it mean to provide air cover to a regulatory review?
I don't know.
Okay. The next one is the ASTDR evaluation. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
And it was your understanding that the ASTDR, which is you understand that's an agency within the CDC?
Yes.
And you understand that they had proposed doing a risk assessment or hazard assessment for glyphosate?
So where they were considering additional work, I don't recall what that additional work was comprised of.
Okay. Do you know if Monsanto requested aid or enlisted the help of any members of the EPA to shut that investigation down?
No.
Okay. The next one is Prop 65. You see that?
Yes.
You know what that refers to?
I think that's shorthand for Proposition 65 in California.
And that's the law in California that basically follows IARC, right?
As I understand it, Proposition 65 uses IARC as one of the criteria for evaluation.
So you don't know, sitting here today, whether or not glyphosate is one of the listed chemicals under Proposition 65?
With absolute certainty, no, I don't.
Okay, well, with general certainty, do you know?
I don't know.
The last one is, in response to the question, why do more, is litigation support. Do you see that?
I do.
And this was specifically referring to lawsuits against Monsanto for Roundup causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, correct?
No, I think it might have related to the Prop 65 case as well. I think when talking about litigation support, it's helping the legal team understand some of the science sometimes.
So we turn to the next page. The first two words are counter IARC, right?
Yes.
And it says it wants to counter all this data, and it lists some possibilities, right?
Yes.
First one is conduct and publish a new meta-analysis, right?
Yes.
We actually talked about that possibility in one of those previous emails.
Yes.
The next one is publication on animal data cited by IARC.
Yes.
Okay. Another one was publish an updated AHS study data. Do you see that?
Yes.
That's another one that we discussed a minute ago.
I recall that.
Publish a weight of the evidence plausibility paper. You see that?
Yep.
That's another one that we discussed previously in that email.
Yes.
Okay. And then it just says genotox MOA. Do you see that?
I do.
You know what that refers to?
It's more vague than the others, and I don't recall exactly what that refers to.
Okay. So we turn to the next page. It discusses the proposal of a meta-analysis, right?
Yes.
Okay. Turn to the next page. It discusses publication on animal carcinogenicity data, right?
Yes.
And then it has the description of the project, right?
It does.
It says Grime and one or two other external authors, question mark. You see that?
Yes.
And has the cost. You see that section about cost?
Yes.
And this is about how much it would cost Monsanto to put this publication together.
Yes.
And then it says majority of writing can be done by Monsanto, keeping OS $ down. Do you see that?
I do.
What is OS $? Is that a...
That's usual shorthand for outside spend.
Okay. So this is suggesting that the majority of writing can be done by Monsanto so we can keep outside spend costs down.
That's what's written.
Okay. Turn to the next page. The AHS collaboration is addressed, right?
Yes.
And describes the project. It says the risk is low, right?
Yes.
The downside, it's a longer-term project, won't get quick results. You see that?
See that written there, yes.
So we have the overall weight of evidence plausibility publication, possibly via expert panel concept, right?
Yes.
And this is where the idea of an expert panel sort of comes more clearly into view in what will later become the Intertek project.
It's a consistent theme in the documents we've looked at. It's impossible to say, but it's a consistent theme.
Okay. The product description is a comprehensive evaluation of carcinogenic potential by credible scientists, right? Project description.
Publish. That's what's written.
Okay. And it actually lists possible panelists and authors, right?
It does.
Dr. Solomon.
There's Solomon is a name there.
And Dr. Solomon actually is ultimately goes on to become part of the Intertek panel, right?
If this is Keith Solomon, then yes.
Okay. All right. Dr. Sorahan for epidemiology. You see that?
Yes.
And then we have Dr. Grime, animal bioassay. You see that?
I do.
Dr. Grime actually was part of the Intertek panel.
If by helmet grime, that's what we mean, yes.
Okay. Do you know any other Grimes by any chance?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. And then G. Williams, that's Gary Williams. You understand who that is?
Another panel member.
He also ended up being on the expert panel for Intertek. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yes.
And then Dr. Kirkland, also on the expert panel.
There's Dr. Kirkland on the expert panel, yes.
Okay, and both Dr. Williams and Dr. Kirkland, they actually did a genotox method of action paper.
I have to go back and review which papers were which, but...
We will get there very soon.
Okay.
All right, so the cost is between $250,000, depending on. Do you see that?
I do.
It says who/how many scientists we include. You see that?
I do.
And then it says how much writing can be done by Monsanto scientists to help keep costs down. You see that?
I do.
And it says an alternative would be one or two separate publications with a subset of authors, right?
That's what's written.
So turning to the last project described in this PowerPoint, GeneTalk/MOA. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the first bullet point is counter IARC's claim of strong evidence of DNA damage / oxidative stress, right?
Yes.
And it says right here, could be important for future litigation support. See that?
I do.
So even at this point, Monsanto, is in your group that are meeting for this meeting on May 11th, are contemplating that at least one of these projects could be important for future litigation.
I didn't put the slide together, but that is what is written there.
Okay, but you were at the meeting, right?
I was.
And you were sent this presentation to review and consider before the meeting.
I was.
Okay. And it was your understanding at that time that part of the work you were doing in responding to IARC would be important for future litigation.
I don't recall exactly what litigation they're referring to there.
All right, so then after the description of all these projects, there's like a sort of quick rundown you see in the next 2 pages called feedback. You see that?
Yes.
And it looks like sort of entries related to feedback from these various stakeholders, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Sorry.
I know you're chewing
Yes.
on ice. Okay. The first one is the meta-analysis, right? You see that?
Yes.
All right. And then the next one is updated AHS study, right?
Yes.
And that one, based on what it says here, was most appealing to the legal group, right?
Yes.
And it explains Monsanto somewhat distance and AHS involved. You see that?
Yes.
Do you recall that legal thought that an updated AHS study would be beneficial for its work?
I don't recall having conversations with them about this.
Okay. Well, based here, it's for the legal group. It says most appealing, right?
That's what's written.
Okay. And if we go on the next one, publish weight of the evidence plausibility paper. Do you see that?
I do.
And it says legal appealing, best if used big names, better if sponsored by some group, right?
That's what's written.
And so in this kind of weight of the evidence plausibility paper, ultimately Monsanto did in fact retain Intertek to put it together, right?
There is an overall review of the weight of evidence and plausibility paper as part of the expert panel.
And you guys put some big names on that panel, right?
Intertek gathered some very well acknowledged or very highly thought of independent experts to be a part of that panel. Yes.
And so it appears that legal's statement here, best if used big names, better if sponsored by some group, those two suggestions appear to have been implemented.
I wasn't a part of those conversations, and so I don't know if what was done met that guidance.
So, Doctor, I've handed you Exhibit 22. This is a series of email exchanges. It's dated May 11, 2015. You see that?
Yes.
And it's from Dr. Haydens, and it's to you and others, right?
Correct.
And these email exchanges, they occurred in the regular course of your work at Monsanto, right?
Yes.
All right. It reads all, here's what I think I heard, and one question in our meeting today. Please send any corrections/additions. You see that?
I do.
So it appears that he's actually talking about the meeting you guys had on the 11th.
That's my interpretation as well.
Okay. And he's talking about really the 5 different projects that we just went through from that PowerPoint. Do you see that? Sorry, 4 different projects.
I see projects that I recognize from seeing in the PowerPoint earlier. Yes.
Okay. And for example, on the publication on animal data cited by IARC, you see that?
I do.
And he says this is the only other idea that could be done prior to monograph publication. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it said it would be more powerful if authored by non-Monsanto scientists, Kirkland, Kyer, Williams, Grime, and maybe Keith Solomon. You see that?
I do.
So it looks at about, during this meeting, do you guys recall discussing getting the animal data published by some reputable scientists, such as Dr. Kirkland, Kyer, Williams, Grime, and Solomon?
Publication of the animal data cited by ARC was an idea at the time.
Do you recall if you responded to this email?
I believe so.
Do you know what you said in response?
I'm not 100% certain.
Okay. Well, I'm going to show you what's Exhibit 23 to your deposition? Great. So this email, Exhibit 23, reflects your response to Bill Hyden's email.
It does.
And you write, and this is an email you sent in the regular course of your work, right?
It is.
And you write, Bill, I agree with everything you've written and have a couple of suggested additions. Please see green text below. Thanks, Mike. Do you see that?
That is correct, yep.
And then it appears that in his email you have added in stuff. Although this isn't in color, you can see that the font is more faded.
The lighter font color, yes.
Okay. And, for example, under the genotox MOA section, you write, I think this was Donna's action item, right?
Yes.
Okay. And she was someone that worked for you at the time.
Yes, Donna Farmer.
Okay. And then, I was looking through the rest of this, and the only other addition I see was under the publication on animal data cited by IARC. You see that?
I do.
And you added, quote, manuscript to be initiated by Mon as ghostwriters, correct?
That's what I see, yes.
And so Mon, that refers to Monsanto, right?
It does.
And so the only addition that you added based on the suggestions or corrections that Bill Hyden's asked for was to mention that Donna would do the genotox MOA and that you wanted the manuscript on the animal data to be initiated by Monsanto as ghostwriters.
There's a couple of things about that publication. So as I mentioned earlier, the publication on animal data cited by IARC was an idea at the time. It was never actually published. And when I mentioned that that ghostwriting has many definitions, from on the one end being providing information, background information, data, things like that, to facilitate an author writing an article on a short period of time.
All right. Well, I don't want to fight with you about what you meant when you wrote this. Do you actually recall what you were thinking when you wrote this?
Yeah, I knew we had very tight timeline. If it was going to get out, if it was going to get done, we needed to facilitate providing information to them, and so that was my intention there.
Okay, so you actually recall what you were thinking when you wrote this?
Yeah.
Okay. From 4 years ago?
I recall that I thought that we needed to enable timelines, and I would not be comfortable with the other definition of ghostwriting that's been provided today.
And if you read it in the context of the sentence immediately afterwards, it was noted that this would be more powerful if authored by non-Monsanto scientists. And it lists a couple of scientists, right?
You've read that correctly?
Earlier, I showed you that email from Dr. Hyden's, where he talked about ghostwriting, right?
Yes.
And you didn't raise any alarm or concern with him in his description of what he was thinking about doing.
No.
And in the same set of meetings related to IARC, you've now written that a manuscript should be initiated by Mon as ghostwriters, correct?
It was a note I made on a project that we were considering at the time that was never conducted.
But now, 2019, January, after lawsuits have been filed against your employer, where allegations of ghostwriting have been alleged, you remember what you meant when you wrote this sentence that a manuscript should be initiated by Mon as a ghostwriter?
I recall that I felt that that ghostwriting in this sense was providing information like background information, references, things like that, to an author to facilitate publication of a paper, because that's what I would be comfortable with.
So we discussed this earlier, but this overall weight and plausibility publication, ultimately there was a expert panel convened through Intertek, correct?
Yes.
I understand that there was a series of articles published in the Journal of Critical Reviews in Toxicology, correct?
Yes.
And these articles reflected the work and opinions of the Intertek panel, correct?
Yes.
Isn't it true that Monsanto directly selected people who would participate in that panel?
It's my understanding that Monsanto provided some names to Intertek, but I don't know that all the people on it were specifically selected.
Okay, and we saw in the document just a few minutes ago several of the names that were even thrown about at the very beginning of this project. They ultimately made it on the panel, correct?
People like Helmut Grime, Larry Kyer, yes, I recall reading those names earlier.
And these were people who were within Monsanto's toxicology network, correct?
The members of the expert panel are acknowledged experts in their field, and so when we want independent thoughts on different things that we might do, we seek out the best minds in the field. And so the fact that some of the people overlapped between the expert panel and people we've consulted with in the past is a matter of their expertise.
All right, Doctor, I'm handing you exhibits 24, 25, 26, and 27.
Okay.
All right, so these are the 4 Intertek publications that we were just discussing, correct?
Yes.
I want to be just very frank with you. Did Monsanto employees review these manuscripts before they were published?
I don't know.
Okay. Did Monsanto's employees write, edit, or make any contributions to any portions of these manuscripts?
Would you read the question back?
Sure. Did Monsanto's employees write, edit, or make any contributions to any portions of these manuscripts?
Can you clarify any contribution?
Let me just be clear. Did they write any of the words that occurred in any of these manuscripts?
I don't know.
Okay. Were you in charge, or did you oversee this Intertek panel at all?
No, I received some notifications on what it would cost, but I was not in charge of the panel.
Okay. But you know Dr. Farmer was heavily involved in it?
Dr. Farmer was involved with a lot of the glyphosate effort at that time, yes.
And she was a toxicologist working under you at the time?
Dr. Farmer has considerable experience with glyphosate, and so I give her a wide path to do what she needs to do. I don't micromanage her.
Sure, fair enough. I didn't mean to suggest that you did. I was just asking that at the time Dr. Farmer was working on the Intertek panel, or working with the Intertek panel, she was working as a toxicologist under you, that's all.
I know that Donna was working on glyphosate-related matters. I'm not sure how close she was to the panel.
So let's turn to the first one, which I believe is number 24. This is the glyphosate rodent carcinogenicity bioassay expert panel review. You see that?
I do.
This is a paper that reviews the long-term animal carcinogenicity studies conducted on glyphosate, correct?
Paper, that's the title and the contents. There's rat information on table 1. There looks like there is mouse information in table 2.
That's a lot of tables there.
There's discussion of hemangiosarcomas in table 3. Liver tumor incidence in table 4. Hepatocellular tumor rates and Cochrane-Armitage trend and Fisher's exact results in table 5. And tumor incidence number of animals examined in table 6. So yes, I think it's fair to say it's a review of the CARC data.
So just to do a short answer question there, this paper appears to be a review of the animal carcinogenicity data related to glyphosate.
Yes, it seems to be a review of all of the available information.
Okay. And if you look at, starting on page 53, top right, of the article, there is something called a declaration of interest. Do you see that?
I do.
And if you read the second paragraph of that declaration of interest, it says, the expert panel members' recruitment and evaluation of the data was organized and conducted by Intertek Scientific and Regulatory Consultancy, Intertek. You see that?
I do.
The expert panelists were engaged by and acted as consultants to Intertek and were not directly contacted by the Monsanto Company. Do you see that?
I do see that.
That's a false statement, right?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know.
So we're in
Okay.
Exhibit 24. We're looking at the Declaration of Interest. And the second paragraph reads, the expert panel members' recruitment and evaluation of the data was organized and conducted by Intertek Scientific and Regulatory Consultancy, Intertek. The expert panelists were engaged by and acted as consultants to Intertek and were not directly contacted by the Monsanto Company. Funding for this evaluation was provided to Intertek by the Monsanto Company, which is a primary producer of glyphosate and products containing this active ingredient. Neither any Monsanto Company employees nor any attorneys reviewed any of the expert panel's manuscripts prior to submission to the journal. Do you see that?
I do.
All right. Is it your understanding, is that a true statement? Are those true statements in that paragraph?
I can speak for myself, and I didn't review or comment on any of the documents there, and I don't know that anyone else did.
Okay. Do you know if any of the panelists on the Intertek panel were directly contracted with Monsanto at the time?
As we talked about earlier, I know there were some consulting agreements for other projects. I don't know how that relates to their membership on the expert panel.
Okay. I'm handing you Exhibit 28, sir. Do you recognize this document?
It looks like a standard project amendment letter from a consulting agreement.
Okay. And this is between Dr. Larry Kyer and the Monsanto Company?
Yes,
And in fact, you signed this agreement, haven't you?
I did.
And this was dated August 2015, correct?
August 17, 2015, yes.
And in here, it actually says specifically project name, Glyphosate Expert Panel, correct?
Item 2, yes.
Well, I was actually under the, that's correct. Under project, it says name, Glyphosate Expert Panel. You see that?
Oh, yes.
And then under deliverables, number 2 is to attend the Intertek Scientific and Regulatory Consultancy Expert Panel meeting either in person or via teleconference, right?
Yes.
And the project contemplates payment not to exceed $27,400, correct?
Total project cost $27,400, yes.
So in fact, Monsanto had contracted to potentially pay Dr. Kyer $27,000 specifically for his work on the Intertek panel.
When I mentioned previously that I was unsure of what was handled directly through the Intertek panel, payment-wise, and what was handled by amendment to existing agreements, that's what I was referring to.
Okay, so when we read in the Intertek panel where it said all the panelists were directly contacted through Intertek and not through Monsanto, that's just not accurate.
With the writing of the paper, I don't know who reached out to them. I did sign a project amendment letter at that time, but I had no communication with Dr. Kyer other than that.
Okay. I'm going to hand you Exhibit 29. Sir, do you recognize this document?
Looks like an amendment to a consulting agreement, yes.
And this is a consulting agreement with Dr. Aqua, Vela and Monsanto, correct?
Yes,
Signed by you.
it is.
And if you look at the last page of it, there's a statement of work. Last page. I'll keep going. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. And again, like with Dr. Kyer, it specifically states the project name, Glyphosate Expert Panel. You see that?
It does.
And it also says attend, under detailed objectives, number 2, attend the Intertek Scientific and Regulatory Consultancy Expert Panel meeting. You see that?
I do.
And it says, number 3, coordinate the epidemiology portion of Intertek and generate a draft manuscript on glyphosate exposure and risk, right?
Coordinate the yes.
And this was, looks like Dr. Aqua was slightly less expensive. This project with Dr. Aqua was not to exceed $24,000, correct?
That's what's written.
And you signed this document?
I did.
Okay. And Dr. Aqua Dr. Kyer are both authors on these Intertek manuscripts, correct?
Kyer. Aqua, yes.
Are you aware if the journal has taken any action since its publication to address concerns about their disclosures?
I heard some hallway talk that there was something being done with the authors of the papers, but I did not hear any specifics. No.
You might tell me what that hallway talk was, to the best of your recollection?
Just that the authors were being contacted about that the editor wanted more information.
Okay. I'm handing you a document. I keep giving you mine. I'm handing you a document, Exhibit 30 to your deposition. This is, as you can see, this is from the Critical Reviews in Toxicology. You see that?
Yes.
And it's titled Expression of Concern. Right?
Yes.
Turn the page. It actually says Expression of Concern regarding critical reviews in toxicology, an independent review of the carcinogenic potential of glyphosate. Do you see that?
I do.
This is referring to the Intertek manuscript publication.
I'm trying to link up what's here with the paper, so.
Sure, I'll do it with you.
Okay.
So it reads, we, the editor-in-chief and publisher of the journal, have been informed of concerns over the completeness of acknowledged contributions to the above supplement and in the declarations of interest provided by the named contributors for the following articles. You see that?
Yeah.
And it goes on and says, we have requested Genda from the authors to provide additional disclosure as to the contributions to the articles. To date, we have only received Genda for 3 of the 5 articles that have been agreed by all authors. We have not received an adequate explanation as to why the necessary level of transparency was not met on the first submission. We thank those who brought this matter to our attention. When reading the articles, we recommend that readers take this context into account. We will continue to work to update these articles and ensure full disclosures of all contributions to them. You see that?
I see that.
Okay. In your time as a researcher and scientist at Monsanto, have you ever seen an expression of concern issued before?
I've seen addenda for articles, core agenda, things like that.
Have you ever seen a journal article issue an expression of concern over the disclosure statements?
I have not.
Okay. And so this journal article did issue one specifically about the articles put out by the Intertek panel.
These appear to be those articles.
And for what it's worth, this is the very weight of evidence plausibility type paper that Bill Heidens talked about ghostwriting back in 2015. Isn't that true?
I have no way of knowing what was published here, how similar or different it is from what Bill might have been thinking about.
But when we talked about those emails from Dr. Heidens, we talked about how this potentially was the genesis of what ultimately became the Intertek panel, correct?
There was a theme of doing an overall review of the data set that IARC looked at, but the relationship between that and this is impossible to determine based on the information in front of me.
And in that email from Dr. Heidens, he literally talks about ghostwriting, right?
That phrase is included in there. I took that to mean a range of things.
And if we, well, I mean, it's interesting because, well, let's just go on. I'm handing you Exhibits 31 Are you looking at 31, sir?
I am now.
Okay. And that one is authored, it was a core addendum authored by the authors of the Aqua Vela article.
Yes.
And this is the same Dr. Aqua Vela that had actually engaged in a contractual relationship with Monsanto for $24,000 to participate in the Intertek panel.
As part of an extension of a consulting agreement, yes.
Okay. And if we look through the Declaration of Interest, I don't really want to read the whole thing. It's particularly long, and it discusses all sorts of various interests that these authors had with corporations like Bayer, Crop Science Holding, Inc., Dow AgroSciences, Syngenta. Do you see that?
Yes.
And at the very bottom of the core addendum, it reads, the authors apologize for these errors. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And if you look at the other core addendums that I've given you, in each one of them, it concludes with the authors apologizing for these errors. Do you see that?
Give me one moment. I'm just trying to make sure I've got all the relevant information in front of me. 31 through 33?
That's right. And so if you look at all the last sentence in all the core addendums, the authors apologize for these errors. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. And I guess my question for you, Doctor, is are you aware if Monsanto has issued any apologies for its role in causing any of these errors?
I'm not aware.
Let's start with your background. Where do you live now?
I live in the suburbs of St. Louis.
And how long have you lived there?
I've lived there for about 10 years.
Are you married?
I am married, and I have 2 children and 2 dogs.
Let's talk a little bit about your education. Where did you get your undergraduate degree?
I have a bachelor's in science and biology from Maryville University in St. Louis.
And where did you get your PhD?
From the University of Iowa.
Okay. After you got done working at, earning your PhD, where did you first work?
My first role was at Will Research in Ashland, Ohio. It's now part of the Charles River system of labs, but they're still located in Ashland, doing regulatory toxicology studies in mice, rats, guinea pigs, dogs, non-human primates.
Did any of your work there have anything to do with glyphosate?
It did not.
What kind of regulatory, when you say regulatory toxicology, what is that?
Regulatory toxicology is a field of toxicology that generates data according to international guidelines. And we've mentioned the OECD test guidelines previously. And those are internationally agreed upon guidelines of how to conduct a certain type of study, whether it's a carcinogenicity study, a genotoxicity study, an acute oral toxicity study. All those types of studies and more have international guidelines on how to conduct a study. What's
the benefit of using OECD standards for your regulatory toxicology?
So the endpoints in OECD studies are known to be accurate predictors of toxicity, whereas investigative science, they may detect a difference, but its relevance to toxicity is unknown.
Do regulatory bodies accept toxicology that doesn't comply with international standards?
No, the test guidelines are international standards, and then there are typically national standards to which they're harmonized. For example, the EPA expects that studies be conducted in accordance with OECD test guidelines, and also any guidance that they have issued as well on that type of study.
And in your practice, both at Monsanto and before, have you made an effort to adhere to good lab practices and international lab guidelines?
Yeah, the good lab practices are sort of a cookbook for how to make a study reproducible. They ensure that accurate records are kept on what was done. And should the study need to be repeated, you would know exactly how to do it. The OECD test guidelines likewise ensure quality by making minimal suggestions of animal number and the endpoints to include.
Are those both good lab practices and international study guidelines? Are those things that you've endeavored to abide by when you've conducted or overseen research?
Yes.
Let's get back to your work history. What did you do after working for Will Labs?
I took a job with Seventh Wave Labs where we did short-term toxicity studies and some work with pharmacokinetics. That was typically done in rats.
And how long did you stay at Seventh Wave?
So at I should also mention at Seventh Wave, that's where I sort of first became involved in people management. I started leading the animal tech group as well as some of the adjacent study directors. And so that was sort of my first experience with oversight. And I stayed there from February of 2018 until, February of 2008 until June of 2010.
And in June of 2010, is that when you were recruited to Monsanto to participate in their Emerging Leaders program?
The recruitment process for the Emerging Leaders in Science program started a little bit before June, and I think I accepted a position sometime in that June time frame with the understanding that I would start in July, as indicated on my CV.
Was the Emerging Leaders program, in your view, an honor to participate in?
It was a select group of individuals selected for technical backgrounds, but also leadership potential. And so I don't ever know what those criteria were, but apparently I possessed them, and they asked me to join. I had a good experience with it. I got to rotate through 3 adjacent groups internally and learn a little bit more about what each did. And I think that's benefited me in the long term.
After you were done with the Emerging Leaders program, you started working in the toxicology department of Monsanto?
Yes. So my first position, once I came out of the Emerging Leaders in Science program, was the New Technologies in Toxicology lead, and that was related to our biotech products. So different varieties, GM varieties of corn or soy or cotton or canola, as well as the traits that were added to those crops, demonstrating the safety of the trait and the grain or other commodity from the crop as well.
So at that point, your work at Monsanto was directed toward crops, not toward pesticides.
Yes, it was strict. There was sort of a strict line between the two disciplines, and I was working solely on the biotech side at that point.
Did you stay in that position for about 2 years?
Yes, I was in that position until I became the Toxicology and Nutrition Center lead in the summer of 2014. In
2014, when you became the Toxicology and Nutrition Center lead, how did that change your responsibilities?
Was more oversight of individuals, a larger team to work with them on both business and development goals. Monsanto places an unusual emphasis, at least for the different places I've worked, on developing people and things they're good at. And so that was a big emphasis in my leadership roles of developing people.
Was that the first time that you had glyphosate as part of your responsibilities and portfolio?
Yes, it was.
Was it part of your responsibilities to ensure that any products Monsanto was pushing was moving forward with development on could be used safely?
Yes.
Did you stay in the Toxicology and Nutrition Center through November of 2015?
Yeah, in November of 2015, we added a team was added to the teams that comprise the Toxicology and Nutrition Center to recreate what had been called the Product Safety Center. That brought the people reporting to me up to about 12 or 13, I think we're at 11 employees right now with 2 open roles. So I think we were right at 13 when the Product Safety Center was recreated. So I had oversight of the biotech tox, the small molecule tox, and the compositional biology. Compositional biology is something a lot of people aren't familiar with, but it looks at nutritional endpoints in GM and non-GM crops to determine if they have similar nutritional profiles.
And you've stayed in that position till the present day?
That's correct.
So is that approximately 8 years at Monsanto?
Yes, it'll be 9 this July. Well, now that Bayer owns Monsanto. So
We talked some about the body named IARC.
yes,
And you were involved in Monsanto's becoming aware that IARC was going to look at glyphosate and then responding once IARC had evaluated glyphosate.
that's correct.
Was part of what you did in your job to understand how IARC was going to review glyphosate?
We had some conversations about the review and the fact that it would be based on publicly available literature.
And I believe you mentioned a number of times during your testimony that there was another body of knowledge, the regulatory data, that accompanies products like glyphosate that are heavily regulated. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I made reference to the regulatory data set for glyphosate because it's an unusually large data set. It has both the Monsanto safety data as well as safety data from other registrants of glyphosate. Since glyphosate went off patent, many other chemical manufacturers had begun manufacturing glyphosate as well, and they've generated safety data in addition to what Monsanto has. So it has a larger safety data set than usual.
What kind of data is in the regulatory safety data?
So there's an extensive toxicology database. There's acute, there's repeat dose, there's developmental and reproductive toxicology, there's genotoxicity, there's carcinogenicity, and quite a few other studies. In addition to human safety studies, there's ecotox studies, residue studies, and just a considerable amount of data.
And that's all generated for each registrant that wants to be allowed to make glyphosate?
So now that the joint, the glyphosate task force has been formed, they're sharing data, but that is a pool of data from which members can pull from.
Do you know when Monsanto first pulled together a package of all this information and provided it to a regulatory body?
I don't.
But glyphosate was first approved sometime in 1975, is that
Yeah,
right?
I know that glyphosate was originally approved by regulatory authorities in the 70s and has been reapproved since then. In the U.S., in Canada, in Europe, in Japan, and Australia. So it's been successfully registered and re-registered around the globe based on the regulatory data set.
And then you said that it's been re-registered a number of times, glyphosate.
Yes.
When glyphosate is re-registered, does that require supplementing the regulatory database that's provided to the regulators?
When new data requirements evolve, we have to meet those data requirements. And so over time, additional data has been generated as regulatory requirements have been put in place.
Am I right that the regulatory data package needs to be submitted before a product is approved by the EPA?
Yes, regulatory agencies expect to review the data. It takes us a couple years, maybe 3-4 years, to typically generate a full data set based on the timing of the studies and how they need to be run sequentially. And then the EPA conducts their review, which can take another 2 to 3 years.
And so that would have happened at least for the first time before 1975. For glyphosate.
If the first approval was in 1975, I would imagine it was submitted well before that. But I don't know for a fact.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you weren't there at the time, but you know that to get approval you have to submit this information.
Yes.
Precisely. What's a six-pack in toxicological terms?
A six-pack is shorthand for a group of studies. Those are acute oral studies, acute dermal studies, acute inhalation studies, eye irritation, skin irritation, and skin sensitization.
With respect to glyphosate, when are those six-pack studies done?
For any chemical, typically you're doing your single-dose work early in the process. Those studies are also conducted for formulations.
And when you say formulations, that's the chemical mixture of glyphosate and something else that is sold as Roundup.
That's correct.
So those tests do apply to formulated product.
That is correct.
Can you just refresh me on what you understand a synergy to be between two chemicals?
When there's a potential for synergy, I typically think of two chemicals who have a similar mode of action. So if they're present together, they might have a greater than additive effect on whatever system they act on.
And when you say mode of action, what does that mean?
How it works. For example, glyphosate inhibits the enzyme EPSPS in plants.
EPSPS?
Yes.
And that's an enzyme that plants use to make amino acids?
It is.
What's the other primary constituent of Roundup besides glyphosate?
There's water, there are dyes, and there are surfactants as well.
How does a surfactant, what's the mode of action of a surfactant?
Surfactants aid in dispersal of the herbicide across the leaf.
Is that the same mode of action as glyphosate?
It's not. Glyphosate specifically inhibits EPSPS.